The first thing I noticed was the color. Not yellow, not tired, not the soft brown plants take on when a cold night catches them too early, but the flat dead brown of something that had been killed on purpose. 54 feet of native shrubs, 21 years of field notes, thousands of pollinator observations. And one of the last living things my wife had planted with her mother were dying along the southern edge of our property. And standing on the hill beyond them, holding a white coffee mug like she had just won something, was the president of Summit Crest Estates. My name is Calvin Mercer, and until that morning, I had spent most of my adult life believing plants were easier to understand than people. Plants tell you when they are thirsty, when they are sick, when the soil is wrong. They do not smile at you over a property line while arranging your destruction. They do not call cruelty neighborhood improvement, and they certainly do not send it through a landscaping company with an invoice marked routine maintenance. My wife Mara and I bought our 7-acre place outside Tamworth, New Hampshire, in the spring of 1999, back when the road was still gravel, and the only thing on the ridge south of us was an old hayfield that belonged to a widower named Silas Pritchard. I was teaching horticultural ecology at Cornell then, which meant I spent half my life explaining to people why native plants mattered, and the other half driving 4 hours home on Fridays because Mara refused to leave New Hampshire. She was a ceramic artist, stubborn in all the best ways, with clay under her fingernails and a laugh that could make a church basement feel like a wedding reception. The land had a spring-fed pond, a crooked apple orchard, and a low southern slope that held the afternoon sun until almost 8 in June. Mara looked at it once and said, "This is where we are going to grow old." And because she said it like a fact, I believed her. We named the property Pritchard Hollow after Silas. We sold it to us for $71,000 and died the following winter. The pollinator corridor started 2 years later after Mara's mother passed away. She had been a school librarian in Rhode Island, the kind who remembered what every child had checked out and would quietly slip a better book into the stack if she thought they needed it. After the funeral, Mara did not cry much. She just stopped talking in the mornings. Then one cold October afternoon, she walked down to the south boundary carrying a spade and a young winterberry shrub in a black nursery pot. I followed her because that is what you do when someone you love carries grief outside. She dug the first hole herself, set the roots, pressed the soil down with both hands, and said, "My mother always told me to leave food for whoever comes after you." That became the beginning of the corridor. Over the next 21 years, we planted winterberry, highbush blueberry, elderberry, nannyberry, gray dogwood, New Jersey tea, serviceberry, and wild rose. Species chosen not because they were fashionable, but because they bloomed in sequence and kept insects alive from early spring through the first frost. By 2012, the corridor had become a thick ribbon of green, nearly 9 feet high in places, alive with mason bees, swallowtails, hummingbirds, and monarchs. I kept a field notebook from the first spring onward. Waterproof paper, pencil only, date, temperature, wind, species, behavior. By the time I retired, those notebooks had filled 2 shelves in my study and supported 4 graduate theses, 2 journal articles, and more student arguments than I can count. Mara called it my quiet obsession. I called it our best work. Then Summit Crest Estates arrived. The old hayfield was sold to a development company from Boston and carved into 43 luxury homes, each with stone chimneys, cedar siding, and windows positioned carefully toward the Ossipee Mountains. The brochures promised uninterrupted northern views, which was an impressive promise considering the developer did not own the land north of them. Most of the buyers understood that. One did not. Blair Kensington bought the highest house on the ridge in January of 2021. A glass-heavy 6-bedroom place with a heated driveway, a pool that looked too expensive to swim in, and a master bedroom window aimed directly at our corridor. She was 48, blonde, polished, and carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who had never heard the word no without assuming it was a clerical error. Her husband, Everett, owned several dental offices near Portsmouth and appeared mainly in photographs beside boats. Blair showed up at our door 3 weeks after moving in, wearing cream boots that had never met mud. She smiled, introduced herself, and said, "Calvin, I hope we can be reasonable about the overgrowth." I told her my name was Dr. Mercer, mostly because she had already managed to make Calvin sound like something she had purchased. She laughed as if I had made a joke. Then she explained that our shrubs blocked the view she had paid for. I asked who had sold her my sky. She blinked once, slowly, and said the developer had represented the view as permanent. I told her that was unfortunate, but representation was not ownership, and the corridor had been there long before her house, her road, or her homeowners association. She tilted her head and said, "Surely you do not need all of it." That sentence stayed with me because of the way she said all of it, as if memory came in excess quantities, as if 20 years of work could be trimmed down to improve the resale value of her bedroom. I told her no. She left smiling. The first letter came 2 weeks later on Summit Crest letterhead, requesting that we reduce all boundary vegetation to 4 feet for neighborhood sightline compliance. We were not in Summit Crest. The HOA had no authority over our property, no easement, no covenant, no shared access, nothing. I replied politely and attached the county survey. Blair sent a second letter, then a third, each one less polite than the last. She filed a complaint claiming our native shrubs attracted aggressive insects. She filed another claiming they created a fire hazard. She filed one more alleging the corridor reduced emergency visibility, though the nearest road was 200 yards away. Each complaint was inspected and dismissed. The county conservation officer, a man named Owen Dyer, walked the corridor with me one rainy morning and said, "Calvin, this is not a hazard. This is the best pollinator habitat I have seen on private land in this county." He wrote exactly that in his report. I framed it for Mara. She laughed when I hung it over my desk and said, "You know that woman is not done." I told her Blair had run out of agencies. Mara shook her head. "People like her do not run out of anything," she said. "They just stop asking permission." That was in February. By early May, Blair had stopped sending letters, stopped waving from her deck, and stopped looking at us when we passed her at the farm stand. Mara noticed before I did. One evening, she watched Blair drive by in her white SUV and said, "She has decided we are not people anymore." I asked what she meant. Mara looked toward the corridor, where the winterberry leaves were just opening, and said, "Once someone stops seeing you as a person, they start believing anything they do to you is maintenance." 9 days later, at 6:20 in the morning, I walked down the south line with my coffee and found the first 30 feet brown, the leaves curled inward, the stems already going soft, and a chemical drift pattern moving north from Blair Kensington's property, like a signature written across 21 years of our lives. I stood there long enough for the coffee to go cold in my hand, staring at leaves that had been green the evening before. And the strange thing was, I did not feel angry at first. I felt embarrassed, as if I had been foolish enough to trust a fence line, foolish enough to believe that because something was clearly ours, documented, surveyed, and loved, another person would understand it was not hers to destroy. Then I saw Mara coming down the path in her red barn jacket, moving quickly because she had seen me from the kitchen window, and the embarrassment burned away. She stopped beside the first winterberry, the one she had planted after her mother's funeral, and touched a curled leaf with 2 fingers. It broke apart in her hand. She looked toward Blair's house on the ridge and said, very quietly, she finally did it. I told her not to touch anything else. Then I took out my phone and started photographing the corridor meter by meter. The dead leaves, the surviving leaves, the direction of the damage, the clean line where the spray had weakened as it moved north. Years of field research teach you to keep your grief out of the data until the data is safe. So I measured before I mourned. The wind station on our shed had recorded a steady southern breeze between 4 and 6 the previous evening, and the chemical pattern followed it perfectly. The worst damage began opposite Blair's pool fence, then narrowed toward the east where the ground dipped. Whatever had been sprayed came from Summit Crest, and whoever had done it had used enough to kill mature woody shrubs, not weeds. I called Owen Dyer at County Conservation, then Dr. Naomi Bell, a former colleague who now ran the state pesticide compliance unit, and finally my son Daniel, who practiced environmental law in Concord and had spent most of his childhood complaining that vacations with me involved more binoculars than beaches. Naomi arrived first with 2 technicians in white protected suits, followed by Owen and a county deputy named Rosa Alvarez, a compact woman with a calm voice and the expression of someone who had learned not to trust expensive explanations. By 9:30, our south field looked like a small government invasion. They photographed the corridor, collected leaf tissue, soil cores, and water from the drainage swale, then marked the affected area with orange flags. Naomi crouched beside the first winterberry, studied the leaf curl, and said, "This is glyphosate. probably concentrated, and it was applied within the last 24 hours. Mara crossed her arms. Can you prove where it came from? Naomi looked up at the ridge. If the lab confirms what I think it will, the drift map will do most of the talking. Deputy Alvarez asked whether we had security cameras. I told her we had one at the barn and another over the driveway, but neither faced the property line. Mara said, Calvin, the wildlife camera. I had forgotten about it. 3 weeks earlier, I had strapped a motion camera to an old sugar maple near the east end of the corridor to monitor a fox den. The camera faced southwest. I walked to it with Rosa and removed the memory card, and we watched the footage at our kitchen table. At 4:47 the previous afternoon, a green landscaping utility vehicle rolled into view on the Summit Crest side. A man wearing a gray cap climbed out with a backpack sprayer. He walked the line slowly, spraying directly into the shrubs. At 4:52, Blair appeared behind him in white tennis clothes, pointed toward the center of the corridor, and said something the camera could not record. The man adjusted the nozzle and sprayed again. Then Blair lifted her phone and took a picture. Mara leaned back in her chair and let out one short laugh, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes the truth is so arrogant it documents itself. Rosa copied the footage and drove up to Blair's house. She returned 40 minutes later with the name of the contractor, Lucas Vane, owner of Granite Edge Property Care. Blair had denied ordering any chemical treatment and claimed Lucas had misunderstood a request to clear poison ivy. There was no poison ivy in the corridor. Lucas lasted even less time under questioning than Blair had. When Rosa reached his equipment yard, he handed over his work log, the purchase receipt for 2 gallons of professional herbicide, and a chain of text messages. The final message from Blair read, "Spray the entire boundary growth, not just the base. I want it permanently gone before summer buyers start coming through." Lucas had replied, "This is not your property." Blair wrote back, "I am the HOA president. I have authorization." She did not. She never had. Daniel arrived just after lunch, read the messages twice and said, "Mom, Dad, this is not a neighbor dispute anymore. This is intentional property destruction, pesticide misuse, and possibly water contamination." Mara asked what would happen to Blair. Daniel closed his laptop and said, "Whatever happens next, she is going to pay for the sentence. I am the HOA president." The laboratory results came back 4 days later. The chemical was a commercial glyphosate product applied at nearly 5 times the recommended concentration, mixed with a surfactant that helped it cling to leaves. It had killed 38 feet of the corridor outright and severely damaged another 11. Trace amounts had reached the drainage swale that fed our pond, though not enough to cause a fish kill. Naomi's office opened a formal pesticide violation case. Rosa referred the footage and messages to the county prosecutor. Daniel hired an independent restoration ecologist to calculate damages, and the estimate came back at $168,000, including mature plant replacement, lost research continuity, soil remediation, and 21 years of ecological value. Blair responded the way people like Blair often do when facts stop obeying them. She became louder. She sent the HOA a 4-page email claiming we had created a hostile environment by refusing reasonable view maintenance. She told neighbors the corridor was diseased and had been removed for public safety. She filed an emergency zoning complaint alleging our remaining shrubs posed a chemical hazard. Then, on a bright Monday morning, she came to our front gate with her attorney, a narrow man in a navy suit who looked deeply unhappy to be standing in mud. I met them at the gate with Daniel beside me. Blair did not apologize. She looked past me toward the dead corridor and said, "This could have been avoided if you had agreed to compromise." Mara stepped out from behind us before I could answer. She was holding the broken branch from her mother's winterberry. She walked right up to the gate and said, "You poisoned a plant I put in the ground while I was grieving my mother, and now you are standing here calling that compromise." Blair's face tightened. "I did not know what that shrub meant to you." Mara nodded once. "That is the problem, Blair. You never asked what anything meant to anyone. You only asked whether it blocked your view." Her attorney touched her arm and whispered something. Blair pulled away and said, "You cannot prove I intended this outcome." Daniel held up a printed copy of her text message. "Permanently gone" sounds fairly intentional. For the first time since she moved in, Blair had nothing to say. She turned and walked back to her SUV, her boots sinking into the wet shoulder of the road, while Mara stood at the gate holding that dead branch like evidence in the trial. older than the law. That evening, Daniel spread survey maps and zoning codes across our kitchen table. The criminal case would move on its own. The civil case was strong, and the state had authority to find both Blair and Lucas. But Daniel was less interested in punishment than prevention. He tapped the southern boundary with a pencil and said, "You can replant the corridor and spend another 20 years waiting for it to mature, or we can replace its ecological function immediately with something she cannot spray through, cut down, or challenge as ordinary landscaping." I asked what he had in mind. He smiled in a way that reminded me of himself at 12, right before he built a canoe ramp off the garage roof. "A vertical habitat," he said. "Steel frame, cedar backing, modular native plant beds, irrigation, nesting blocks, bat shelters, 20 feet high, maybe 60 feet long." Mara stared at him. "You are suggesting a living wall." Daniel nodded. "A federally registered pollinator restoration structure, protected under the agricultural conservation exemption." I looked through the kitchen window toward Blair's house, its glass walls shining on the ridge above the dead shrubs. Daniel followed my eyes and added, "And yes, Dad, it would block every single window she poisoned those plants to improve." The idea sounded ridiculous for about 30 seconds. Then it began sounding practical, and by the time Daniel finished explaining the permitting path, I realized it was not revenge at all, at least not in the legal sense. It was restoration with excellent sightline consequences. We called my former graduate student, Elise Rowan, who had left academia to design ecological installations for schools, hospitals, and public gardens across New England. She arrived 2 days later in a muddy pickup with rolled drawings under one arm and walked the dead corridor without speaking. At the first winterberry, she stopped beside Mara, touched the bark, and said, "We cannot replace the years, but we can replace the work those years were doing." By sunset, we had the bones of a design. The structure would stand 6 feet inside our boundary, 64 feet long and 20 feet high, supported by galvanized steel posts set in deep concrete footings. The side facing our house would be clad in cedar, warm and quiet, like an old New Hampshire barn. The southern face would hold modular planting trays, climbing vines, nesting tubes for mason bees, shelters for leafcutter bees, and bat boxes near the top. We selected 76 native species arranged by bloom time, early spring plants on the eastern end, midsummer flowers through the center, asters and goldenrod toward the west. It would function like a calendar, April to October, one section waking as another faded. Daniel filed it as an agricultural pollinator restoration project. Naomi supported the application with the pesticide incident report. Owen provided the habitat assessment, and the Regional Conservation Office approved a $42,000 cost share. The county zoning administrator signed the agricultural exemption in 3 business days. Blair learned about it on the 4th. She called me at 7:15 that evening, skipping hello entirely. "You were building a 20-foot wall to punish me." I looked out the kitchen window at Mara sorting winterberry seeds into envelopes. "No," I said, "we are building a pollinator habitat to replace the one you poisoned. Do not play games with me, Calvin. It blocks my entire view." I almost corrected her on the name again, but by then it seemed unnecessary. "Your view was never on your property, Blair." There was a silence. Then she said something I still remember because it revealed more than she intended. "People like you always hide behind rules." I laughed quietly. "Blair, you are the president of a homeowners association. Rules are your entire personality." She hung up. The next morning she filed a zoning appeal, an HOA emergency motion, and a request for a temporary restraining order in county court. The HOA motion had no effect because we were not members. The zoning board rejected her appeal unanimously. The judge denied the restraining order in a 7-page decision stating that no homeowner possessed a protected right to a scenic view across another person's land. Blair attended the hearing in a pale blue suit and stared at me through the entire ruling. Outside the courthouse, she stepped close enough for me to smell her perfume and said, "You think you have won." Mara, who had been silent all morning, answered before I could. "No, Blair, we think the bees won." Construction began in late June. The sound of the auger drilling the first footing carried up the hill, and Blair appeared on her deck within minutes, phone in hand, filming every worker as if she were documenting an invasion. When the first steel post went vertical, she called the sheriff. Deputy Alvarez arrived, checked the permit, checked the survey markers, then looked up at Blair's deck and gave her a small wave. The second post went up while Rosa was still there. By mid-July, The frame stood like the ribs of a ship along the empty boundary. Cedar panels followed, then cables, irrigation lines, planting trays, bee shelters, and bat boxes. Neighbors began stopping by, first out of curiosity, then with plants. A retired teacher brought swamp milkweed from her garden. A family down the road brought serviceberry seedlings. 3 children from Summit Crest arrived with their father carrying a tray of wild bergamot and whispered that their mother had told them not to let Blair see them. Even 2 HOA board members came one Saturday morning and apologized for supporting her view restoration campaign. One of them, a quiet accountant named Scott, said, "We thought she meant trimming branches. We did not know she meant poisoning another man's property." I told him that was the trouble with giving power to people who treat vague language like a loaded weapon. The wall was fully planted by the first week of September. From our side, it was cedar. Green leaves, small flowers, and the soft mechanical sound of drip irrigation. From Blair's side, it was 20 feet of legal, federally supported vegetation blocking her living room, bedroom, pool deck, and the window beside the exercise bike she had once positioned toward the mountains. On the morning the final tray was installed, Mara and I stood near the first winterberry stump, which we had left in the ground. The workers removed the lift, sunlight hit the upper vines, and a monarch landed on the fresh milkweed less than 5 minutes later. Mara covered her mouth. I had spent my career telling students not to assign human meaning to animal behavior, but in that moment I decided retirement had earned me one exception. We dedicated the structure a month later and named it the Evelyn Shaw Memorial Pollinator Wall after Mara's mother. Mara had not known about the name. When Elise uncovered the plaque, Mara cried, then laughed because the first mason bee had already sealed one of the nesting tubes with mud. The criminal and civil cases ended that winter. Lucas lost his commercial pesticide license for 18 months, paid restitution, completed environmental training, and wrote us an apology that sounded sincere. He admitted Blair had told him the HOA controlled the boundary and that he had ignored his own doubts because business was slow. I accepted his apology. Blair never offered one. She pleaded to reduce property damage charges, paid $38,000 in criminal restitution, received 2 years of supervised probation, and was permanently barred by court order from directing pesticide use within 500 feet of our land. The state fined her an additional $65,000 for pesticide misuse and water contamination. Our civil claim settled for $140,000 plus legal costs. She resigned as HOA president 3 days after the settlement became public. Everett had filed for divorce before spring. Their house went on the market that summer, but the listing photographs carefully avoided every northern window. 2 buyers withdrew after seeing the wall in person. A third family bought the property for nearly $200,000 less than Blair had paid. They came over during their first week with 3 children and a jar of honey from their old neighborhood. The youngest boy pointed at the bee shelters and asked whether the bees would sting him. Mara knelt beside him and said, "Only if you behave like the previous owner." His mother tried not to laugh. I did not. By the second summer, the wall supported more monarch caterpillars than the original corridor had during its best recorded year. Local schools began visiting on Fridays. One girl named June started volunteering every Saturday and now says she wants to study conservation biology. Mara walks the wall every morning, east to west, the same direction she once walked the shrubs. The old winterberry stump remains beside the first bay, weathered gray and hollow at the center, like an empty chair kept at a family table. I still think about Blair sometimes, and I wonder whether we went too far. She destroyed something irreplaceable, and we responded by building something larger that permanently changed the value and experience of her home. The law called it restoration. She called it revenge. Maybe both descriptions contain a little truth. So tell me what you think. Was the 20-foot living wall justice? Or did we become cruel once we realized how completely it would block her view? Leave your answer in the comments. And tell me what you would have built on that property line. Share this story with someone who has ever watched an HOA confuse authority with ownership. And subscribe, because the next time somebody says it is only a hedge, only a tree, or only a garden, you may be looking at the most important thing another person ever planted.